So we come to our first major philosophical problem. What does the existence of habitual processes, properly understood, imply for solving the problem of action? You remember that the problem of action is just this question. What distinguishes your actions from things that merely happen to you? What distinguishes, for example, falling downstairs intentionally as part of a stunt from falling downstairs because you have tripped and have an unfortunate experience? The latter something that happened to you, the former is your action. What in general can we say about the distinction? The standard solution is attractive to us for two reasons. One is it's a very simple idea, the other is that it has widespread credence among philosophers and has held that credence for a long time, at least since Donald Davidson, perhaps a lot longer before that. The idea is that actions are those events which stand in an appropriate causal relation to an intention. Very good. All right, what could go wrong? Well, here's an objection. There are some instrumental actions that manifestly run counter to an agent's objection. There are some instrumental actions that manifestly run counter to the agent's intentions. Now, there's two questions that we need to ask about this objection. The first is, well, look, why is this an objection at all? Let's see why it is. The problem in effect is that where the actions run counter to the agent's intentions, those actions can't stand in any appropriate relation to an intention. But hang on a minute, right? Steve, what is this appropriate business? Why is that in the standard solution at all? Steve, I'm glad you asked because we haven't talked about that at all. The usual way to show that the word appropriate is needed here is by appeal to what Donald Davidson calls deviant causal chains. So to adapt his famous example very slightly, you are there as one of two climbers, you're roped together, you're exhausted, you're stuck on the mountain, stormy weather, the person below you falls and slips and you are now locked together by the rope and the person's dangling from the rope. Now, in this situation, every climber knows that you absolutely stay together. That is the golden rule of climbing. But you're exhausted, you're tired, and perhaps we can understand why, on this occasion, you do form the intention to let the rope go. You form that intention. Realizing what you have just decided, you are now so horrified that your hands begin to shake and you lose your grip on the rope. You never acted on the decision, although, of course, your action aligns with the decision and indeed caused the action. So here, the intention to let the climber go does cause the action of letting the climber go, and clearly the two things are coherently related. The intention is to let the climber go, and that is the cause of the action. But, says Davidson, it doesn't stand in the appropriate causal relation. This doesn't count as a case that we want to include in the standard solution because the intention caused your action in what we might say the wrong way, right? The intention caused you to shake your hands, you could no longer hold the rope at all because you were so terrified, horrified by this realization about what you were about to do, breaking this very taboo thing. So the solution then is to use the word appropriate in expressing the standard solution. Now, of course, appropriate is a placeholder. We have to go on and say what appropriate is. And here, interestingly, philosophers divide. So there are philosophers who think we just can't solve this and therefore we have to reject the standard solution. And there are other philosophers, I've referred to Josh Shepherd, for example, who's given a recent attempt to fill in the details here. Now that's a very, very, very long discussion, lots of kind of technical details and clever moves and so on. What we need is just a minimum, right? And I take it that anybody who accepts the standard solution should also accept this. In order for the causal relation to be appropriate, minimally, the action should not be manifestly counter to the intention. Neither should whether the action occurs be independent of what the agent intends. Those are the two necessary but not sufficient conditions for this causal relation to be appropriate. And now you can see why the objection is an objection. So the question was, look, why is the objection an objection? Why is it a problem that some instrumental actions manifestly run counter to the agent's intentions? What that shows is that there is no intention which stands in an appropriate causal relation to an action. But the standard solution requires that there are no such actions, and the objection says, oh yes, there are. Make sense? Very good. All right, so the second question is, how do we know that the objection is true? How do we know that some instrumental actions manifestly run counter to the agent's intentions? Another good question. Let's try and answer it. The truth is that we've been studying what happens when you devalue an outcome. So when you, for example, allow someone to sate themselves on chocolate milk, you know that their preference for chocolate milk versus peppermint tea will change, right? Whereas previously they would have preferred chocolate milk. Now I'm just absolutely maxed out on chocolate milk, and so what I'd like is peppermint tea. I'm feeling a bit kind of queasy in the stomach from all that chocolate milk, in fact, so I really want the peppermint tea. Devaluation has changed my preferences, but if the action of seeking chocolate milk persists, then it looks like that's running counter to my intentions, because after all, it wouldn't be rational for me, given that I prefer chocolate milk, given that I prefer peppermint tea, to form an intention to seek out chocolate milk. Now let's look at this a bit more carefully, a bit more slowly. So you remember perhaps from a previous section that we looked at a study involving stress in chocolate milk. This is Schweber and Wolf from 2011. And what they did was very simple. So they had two buttons and people were trained so that one button essentially provided chocolate milk, let's say half the time. There was also some orange juice, I'm skipping that, and peppermint tea in 1 in 5 cases and otherwise nothing. And the other button was the peppermint tea button. And what they found out was very simple. When they have a control group who are not stressed, after devaluation, they are seeking out the chocolate milk much less. They're pressing that button much less, significantly reduced. But when there's a stressed group, over here on the other side, the stressed group are seeking out the chocolate milk just as much after it was devalued as before. So here's the thought, very simple idea. It's very unlikely that stressing people out here will change their preferences or their intentions. So it's quite reasonable to think that the intentions across the two groups concerning the chocolate milk and the peppermint tea ought to have been the same. Right? Why would stressing out change those? What we know from the dual process theory is that the stress can increase cognitive load, and so may make whatever intentions we have less effective, and therefore allow the habitual processes to dominate the actions more strongly. That's what we seem to be finding here. But if that's right, then many of these choices on the right-hand side in the stress group, and also perhaps a few of them on the left-hand side, will be choices that run counter to intention. They will be choices that run counter to intention. Sometimes your instrumental actions manifestly run counter to your intentions, right? It's not that you somehow think, oh, maybe this button is the peppermint tea button or something like that. It's really, it's the chocolate milk button. It's not that you have a preference for chocolate milk, but that habitual process is driving the action quite firmly. Now here's a second study that I'm going to sneak in here just because it's interesting and relatively simple, right? A really fun idea. So Neil and colleagues from 2011, they just had too much fun really. What they did was they went to a cinema. This of course was in the time before the COVID. So they went to a cinema and they studied a group of people eating popcorn. Their participants were in the cinema watching a film, eating popcorn. And they divided their participants in advance among those who had almost no habit of eating popcorn when at the cinema, a moderate habit or a high habit. So they would always have popcorn in the cinema. They also divided them further into different groups. Some were given stale popcorn and some were given fresh popcorn. And what you can see here is that those who had a low popcorn habit, who didn't typically eat popcorn, ate far less of the stale popcorn than they did of the fresh popcorn. They ate more of the fresh popcorn. Whereas for people with high habit, you see them eating statistically indistinguishable amounts of popcorn. They actually ate slightly more stale popcorn than fresh popcorn. But when those same participants were put in a different situation, so they were put in a meeting room, they all discriminated between the stale and the fresh popcorn by eating, as you would expect, more of the fresh popcorn. What does this tell us? Something very simple. Just as the dual process theory of instrumental action predicts, when you eat popcorn in the cinema regularly, there is a habitual process: stimulus, cinema area, action, eating the popcorn, and that stimulus, action, link will be relatively strong compared to people who are not frequent eaters of popcorn in that situation, and so your actions may be dominated by that stimulus action link in a way that's entirely independent of your preferences and intentions. Take away that stimulus and you behave quite differently in the meeting room context. Sometimes then, I take it Neil et al. Is another illustration of this fact, your instrumental actions manifestly run counter to your intentions. Your instrumental actions manifestly run counter to your intentions. What you've got to say here is that, if you want to hold on to the standard view, is that people in the stale popcorn condition who had the high habit had more intentions to eat popcorn, right? Intended to eat the popcorn even after they discovered it was stale, compared to the people who did not have that habit. But that just seems, far less plausible than the explanation offered by the dual process theory of instrumental action, whose predictions, as we've seen earlier, are supported in a whole variety of cases. So we know that some instrumental actions manifestly run counter to agents' intentions from studies involving various kinds of devaluation, either getting you to eat to satiety or alternatively providing you with nasty and nice versions of popcorn or any other thing. Very good. So here's where I think we've got to so far. The standard solution says that actions are those events which stand in an appropriate causal relation to an intention, but it seems that that's false. It seems that the dual process theory of instrumental action, whose predictions are nicely confirmed, implies that there are instrumental actions which manifestly run counter to your intentions, and these will be cases, not all of them, but many of them, where the action is dominated by a habitual process, therefore a stimulus action link, that has nothing to do with your intentions. Now, we do need to be careful here. The claim is not that every case where habitual processes dominate will be one that runs counter to or independently of your intentions. You may, as we have discussed earlier in the question session from lecture 1, for example, you may well find a situation where someone forms an intention and intentionally creates a habit in themselves. You may find, if you're a happy person, that for much of your life, the habitual responses that you give, those dominated by the habitual processes, line up perfectly with your intentions because you have that kind of expertise and training. That's really good for you. So the objection here doesn't say that where a habitual process dominates, necessarily there's a conflict with intentions. Not at all. It says that this is something that can happen, and the popcorn and the chocolate milk stress experiments that we have just seen are good examples of where that actually does happen under observable, repeatable conditions. And it's for this reason, the fact that some instrumental actions manifestly run counter to your intentions because they're governed by habitual processes which, as it happens, conflict with your intentions, that we have to reject the standard solution. Now, if you write an essay for me, you will often see this piece of feedback. Consider responses to the objections that you defend. Right? How might someone who defended the standard solution reply to this objection? Unless we've considered that, we shouldn't really be very confident that the objection is right. What you will see time and time again in philosophy is that the philosophers are pretty subtle. So where it seems like we have a compelling objection, often it turns out that we don't. We can't be sure until we've considered possible replies. Now, what I want to do in this recording is just to consider what I'm going to call responses. So these are not yet replies. They're responses that may eventually lead you to formulate a reply. I think of a reply as involving some level of argument, some reason to doubt, or at least on the face of it reason to doubt that the objection is true, whereas a response doesn't have to meet that high standard. So the first response might be, look, let's insist that there is always an intention. Whenever we have an instrumental action, we do have an intention. Now, the first thing to note here is that that's just an assertion. That's why I'm calling this a response, not a reply. We have to give some kind of strong motivation for this assertion, and that motivation has to be independent, of course, of accepting already the standard solution. The first thing to note about this possible response is that there's no contradiction between this and the dual process theory of instrumental action. So the dual process theory of instrumental action says that there are always both habitual and goal-directed processes. They're always at play there, and that one or another can dominate. It won't always be the same one that dominates. But that is, strictly speaking, consistent with saying that there is always somewhere, perhaps far in the background, an intention which is ultimately guiding your action, where that appropriate causal relation between intention and action is there. So nothing's ruled out yet. Nothing's ruled out yet. But in order to make this response, we have to be committed to some pretty implausible seeming claims. So consider what you have to say about those popcorn eaters. What you have to say is that the popcorn eaters have some kind of intention here when they have the high habit, but those in the lower group sometimes are lacking that intention or are not acting on that intention. Now, there are two ways to do this. So you can say the intention to eat stale popcorn is more common in the high habit group, and that seems incredibly tricky, right? So you might think, aha, Steve, it's fine, it's fine. Those who have, in the high habit group, have a greater liking for popcorn, and so are much less discriminating because they just really need that popcorn. But if we go back to Neil et al.'s study, you can see that they saw us coming here. They saw us coming. Now, it's very important if we're considering a response that we look carefully to be sure that people who are in line with the objection, they haven't already considered the response. So Neil and colleagues note that the strong habit participants did experience the shift in motivation as a function of the food's freshness. They rated the fresh popcorn more likeable than the stale, and so they didn't value the popcorn more than those with weak habits. Right? So they've done their homework here. Neil and colleagues, this is a careful peer-reviewed experiment where they've looked carefully to be sure that the strength of habit that you had, strong, medium or weak, didn't actually interact with how much you liked or preferred the fresh to the stale popcorn. They go on. Furthermore, tests of whether the habit effects depended on the liking for popcorn or current hunger revealed that these factors did not moderate the effects of habit strength on eating. Aha. Now this is the critical thing, and this is what you're going to see time and time again in research on habitual processes and instrumental action. The action was independent of the liking for popcorn. The action was independent of the liking for popcorn. And that makes it very hard for you to say, well, look, they had an intention to eat the popcorn just as much, just as frequently, when they liked it not, as when they liked it much. Right? That's kind of like, well, then their intentions are a bit screwed up, right? So you want to say that they've got irrational intentions. Now that might be true. To be clear, the objection is not a decisive demonstration beyond all doubt that the standard solution is false, right? All kinds of crazy things can happen. But we won't get a good reply to the objection by postulating that some kind of crazy pattern of intention is going on here, by postulating that the people who high habit have this irrational pattern where, despite less liking for the popcorn, nevertheless form the same intentions, right? Your intentions are supposed to relate to your desires. So I think that option one is probably not going to fly. But there is another option, right? So we can appeal to other intentions here. So we might say, look, although there was not an intention to eat the stale popcorn, people in the high habit group will have had intentions like the intention to empty the bag or the intention to grasp some popcorn, and then having it in their hand, perhaps they formed an intention to get rid of it, but they didn't want to throw it on the floor, so they popped it into their mouth, right? So their action was rational, and it was intentional under some description, even though they may not have had an intention to eat the popcorn. Now, this might work, but what's extremely tricky here is that you have to say that this is going to be more frequently true amongst the people who have the high habit than people who have the low habit. And again, that just looks very ad hoc. It looks like, yeah, this is a response to the objection. You're making an assertion which, if true, would contradict the basis on which, or some of the basis on which we're accepting the objection. But it doesn't seem like there's any reason to accept that assertion that you're making here yet. We haven't got a reason in view yet, at least not one that doesn't presuppose the correctness of the standard view. So the challenge for you, if you like this option 2, is to come up with some independent reason for accepting that claim about intention. Very good. So where are we? I'm saying that the standard solution to the problem of action is confronted by the objection that some actions manifestly run counter to agents' intentions. Right? Just as we'd expect on the dual process theory of instrumental action. It doesn't imply this, but it tells us to expect it, and we can see that in practice it does happen. Sometimes your actions are guided by stimulus-action links, and sometimes those stimulus-action links run counter to what, in that particular situation, you intend. Right? Not always, and perhaps not very often, but sometimes they do. And that tells us that we can't think of actions as events which stand in appropriate causal relation to an intention. Now, we've just seen a first response, which was to insist that there is, in fact, always an intention in view in those examples. What I've suggested to you is it's going to be difficult to establish that response, but I leave it to you to perform the full evaluation. So I don't think I've given you a kind of decisive view about whether that response is going to be able to generate a good reply or not. That, for me, is an open question, one that I hope you're going to answer for me. But you might prefer to take a second response. The second kind of response is to deny that all instrumental actions are actions. So here you might be thinking this. I've got this problem of distinguishing actions from things that merely happen to an agent. And Steve has come along with this notion of instrumental action, that's to say an action which is in one sense or another directed to a goal, where the directedness can be grounded either in the habitual processes or in the goal-directed processes. Right, saw that in lecture 1. Okay, very good. But then you want to say, Steve, I think that was a little bit too quick. Right, that was a little bit too quick. You might want to say, Steve, I think that when the directedness of an instrumental action to a goal relies on the habitual processes, that isn't really an action. It's something that happens to you. Right, there I am, I've got this habit of eating popcorn in the cinema, you give me this box of stale popcorn and I'm nevertheless munching through it. Kind of miserable, right? It's making me really unhappy and grumpy because it's actually quite disgusting. And I'm eating 60% of this, well, it's not good, right? And you want to say, that's something that merely happens to me, right? Steve, that wasn't an action. You weren't actually acting when you were eating the popcorn. Your body was merely the arena for some popcorn eating. That was not an action of yours. And that has all kinds of consequences, right? I'm not morally responsible. I'm not morally responsible. Maybe I'm not even legally responsible, and so on and so forth. All right, so you see how this is going to go, right? You see how this is going to go. Logically, there is a response that you can make here. You can try to narrow the problem of action so that what it targets doesn't include actions where the habitual processes dominate, or at least not ones where it conflicts with the intention. But just in doing this, in turning this response, an assertion that simply contradicts the objection, into a reply, some kind of reasonably well independently motivated claim that contradicts the objection. In doing this, you're going to have to first of all say, well, how is it that we can lock onto the actions? I take it that antecedently we would have thought that all of that popcorn eating by all of the groups was an action, looked just like an action, right? So we wouldn't have wanted to distinguish between those things. And in particular, you're going to have to deny getting yourself into a kind of circle where you say, look, I'm interested in the kind of actions which are intentional. Ooh, right, okay. And those actions are actions that are in some way or another appropriately causally related to an intention. So that looks like the whole thing is just tied up very tightly in advance. And there's no way that anybody could object to that. But by the same token, that's just not a very interesting position to maintain. So the challenge here is to come up with some principled way of ruling out the problematic actions, the actions that lead to this objection. So in conclusion, I want to suggest to you that on the face of it, the standard solution faces an excellent objection. Because the objection isn't decisive, there may well be a way along one of the two lines I've suggested or along some other line to come up with a response to the objection. And I would encourage you to do that. Alternatively, if you're not antecedently committed to the standard solution, then I suggest to you that the objection, although not decisive, is sufficient for us to rule out the standard solution. The problem then is what becomes the problem of action. Should we look for an alternative solution, or should we recognise that there might be something wrong in the way that we have formulated the problem? In any case, there is no easy way from here, and I leave it in your hands.